Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for choosing to spend the next hour with us, and hopefully with some pizza as well. So hopefully the pizza is good, and we'll talk about that in case your pizza is not in front of you. I'm joined today by Dave Ferg, Senior Consultant. Many of you have had the pleasure of working with him or been in one of his prior sessions in one of our webinars or events. So we're happy to have Dave with us, and we're excited that you're with us today. Taking a little bit different angle on Azure services today. So traditionally, we've talked about backup. We've talked about looking at migration, so migrating traditional on-prem services up to Azure, or looking at putting storage up into Azure, or security. How do we secure Azure? So we looked at all those things, and you'll see some options in the evaluation today if you want some of that information from prior sessions. But today we're going to be taking a little bit different look, and we'll be looking at purpose-built Azure services. So instead of just moving a on-prem server to make it an Azure server in the cloud, these are actually looking at moving those, a particular server up to an Azure service. So think of them as kind of pre-built servers. So it reduces the amount of configuration, et cetera, that you would have to do. And Dave will be diving into the different types of things that are available there. And hopefully it should provide some new options for you and perhaps save you some time and effort to be able to move up some of those types of things. So looking at the agenda, we'll do a few introductory remarks, then Dave will jump into the various areas that you see here, looking at Entra Domain Services, Files, Database, App Services, and Serverless. So we'll be diving into those 5 areas as well. So a little bit of background, or a little bit of housekeeping rather. So first, if you don't have your pizza yet, please be patient. Note Julie Dellinger's email address on the screen. If it doesn't show up in the next few minutes, you can always email her and she'll try to help you out. We do find that if you look for wherever food disappears in your office, if you're at the office, look there and maybe it's there. We also find people that are the delivery person's on the other side of a locked door. So you can also check either at your home or at your office to see if perhaps the delivery driver's on the other side of a locked door, if that's the way things are in your office. A little bit of other housekeeping. So the first thing is that presentations in presentation mode, or the audio is, so that you can hear Dave and I, but we keep it in presentation mode so that any noise where participants may be doesn't come through to the whole group. But you can reach me at any point during today's session through chat or through the questions tab. In fact, if you put your questions into the questions tab at the end when we do Q&A, then I'll read off those questions for Dave and he'll be able to address them that way. We want to make sure this is an educational time for you, and so please put in your questions at any point. If they're more involved, or if there's, we're not able to get to all the questions, by having them in writing also allows us to then be able to email you back with those answers. The next piece is the presentation. This presentation and the recording of it will be sent out to you by email today, so you'll get a PDF of the deck and a link to the recording. So hopefully that will enhance the educational piece, keep you from having to write too much. And I mentioned the evaluation. Takes 1 to 2 minutes to do, 2 minutes if you get distracted, sort of thing. It is quick, but it gives you a chance to say what else that you may need informationally, and also let us know how we do, so we can try to make sure that's better, and we try to keep it fun by picking a couple of the completed evaluations, and we'll either then make an offer. You can either choose an Amazon gift card for $50 or a gift card towards your favorite restaurant. So we try to keep it fun as well. A little bit about System Source. We have a number of new people, but I'll go through this quickly. So System Source has been around since 1981, about 75 of us at System Source. And we work with IT professionals from South Central Pennsylvania all through Central Maryland into DC, as well as national companies that have their headquarters here. So we work with them across a number of areas, starting with where it says acquire. So as people need to acquire new IT technologies, whether that's in user computing or in the data center, we help folks in both of those areas. But most of the work we do is in the data center, either in traditional on-prem servers, so all the on-prem stuff that we've traditionally used, or in the cloud variants of that. So principally in Microsoft Azure, also in Amazon Web Services, But really, regardless of where you put that, it could be software as a service applications, it could be hosting your servers or rented servers at hosting facilities in our facilities, wherever that you may choose to put those servers. So we're kind of agnostic as to where the data lives, or the storage lives, or the compute lives, but we can try to help design that in ways that make sense for you, and to be able to support regardless of where that data and compute lives for you, whether it's in Azure, so web services, on-prem, etc. So we work with folks like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, the whole stack there, VMware, Veeam, Cisco Meraki, Barracuda, Arctic Wolf, Hewlett Packard Enterprise, HP Aruba, etc., to design solutions based on whatever your needs that you present to us are, that would be able to take care of those data center solutions, whether it's an on-prem piece or whatever the analogous piece would be from those number of manufacturers, but for the cloud. We also, so that kind of brings us for improvement. So we talked a little bit about the design and cloud services, but train is another important one, with 600 plus classes available through our learning center for all the technologies that I've talked about and manufacturers that we've discussed, and actually about 2 or 3 dozen more, whether it's technical for IT professionals or in user computing, in user training, all is available there, and everything's available remote as well. And Present is professional AV, so think Teams rooms, WebEx rooms, Zoom rooms, so all the displays, projectors, microphones, speakers, the design services for those conference spaces, presentation spaces, executive offices, large venues, all those types of things are what our presentation systems group does, including digital signage. And finally, we support all these things down at the bottom under maintain, whether it's on a reactive basis, you call us when things go bump under service and support, or on a proactive basis, where we are the IT department for many clients in this region under managed services. So that's a little bit about System Source today. We appreciate your working with us there. Also, we have some upcoming webinars, so there's a number here. So just I will drop the information and the registration links in the chat while Dave is speaking. But we have one that's coming up on the 4th for about Power BI. We have another one coming up on the 7th, which is a shorter 30-minute session. Most of our sessions are an hour, like today's. So that'll be really looking at Wi-Fi 7 as Cisco Meraki kind of envisions it, and kind of planning ahead for that. Then we'll talk about Microsoft Teams rooms. That'll be our AV group. Then we'll look at email security for really kind of what things are making it through your email security, your current defenses, and how do we kind of bolster those up. Those are the next things that are coming up, and again, I'll drop those into chat. With that, let me go ahead and hand the reins over to Dave, please.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm hoping that this next hour, I guess about 50 minutes now, gives you some things to consider as you're thinking about and planning your move to Azure. So today, we're going to be talking more on the platform as a service offerings. We have typically in the past have done several seminars, as Chris has already mentioned, in the infrastructure as a service. We have talked about servers and storage and firewalls, routing, those kinds of things that are basically just taking your current data center and moving it up into the cloud, reducing your on-prem footprint, but basically having an analogous system sitting in the cloud. Today, we're just going to extend that out a little bit, and we're going to move out and introduce, and not cover in detail because it's just, that would be just far too much for one day, but introduce the idea of platform as a service, the idea where you're going to potentially define how much compute you want supporting your application, but then you don't have to manage that compute. Microsoft will do that. You will then manage your application. That's the idea of platform as a service, is you're trying to take away the need to manage the infrastructure for that particular application and just focus on the application. So what we're going to do today is just introduce a few of the ones that we get asked about most frequently, at least today, and just give you a little bit of background on them, try to give you an idea of where you could use these things. And if you need more conversation on these particular services we'll talk about or others, again, I'm just giving you a sample, we'll be more than glad to meet with you. So let's first start talking about why move to services as opposed to servers in the cloud. The first is a potential, I should have underlined that word, potential cost savings. If you move your application to the cloud, yes, you're losing a little bit of your on-prem footprint, potentially able to save some costs in heating, cooling, things like that, if you do enough of it that you actually can reduce the amount of hardware in your system. But you're also reducing costs of managing the platform that sits on. So there's a potential there. There's also potential, I'm just going to be blunt here, there's a potential the cost could go up because you're moving from an on-prem world to a cloud world that for most people, in fact, everybody I've ever come across as far as a client goes, you're moving to a far more robust environment with more options to replicate data, more options to build DR and high availability. So you may be improving your environment by deploying things out that are far more resilient or flexible than what you have on-prem. So cash out of pocket may be a little bit more because you're just getting more at that. You will definitely save costs at refresh times when you're not having to maybe potentially buy another SAN or replace a hypervisor server or something like that. So there is some possibilities for cost saving. That's why I just want to put potential. We're more than glad to walk this through with you in a whiteboard session or something to kind of see where your costs are going to be. Because some people do end up paying more because they're wanting to implement more now that they have the ability to implement more up in the cloud than they did on-prem. All right. Scalability, I've already kind of alluded to that. You're moving your applications and your data up into a global network. So not only can you place your data in many more locations than you probably can do now, you now have the hardware infrastructure to build highly available, highly fault-tolerant systems, scale sets, meaning scale sets are you define a series of VMs, if you will. I'm just going to keep it that simple, that can be brought online as needed by utilization or taken offline as needed by utilization. So you have these capabilities with you that you probably don't have on-prem, for at least for most of us. Reliability. The easiest picture of that is when we talk about storage, and that storage, and every time you write to a storage account, there's 3 copies of your data. Could be 3 copies in the same data center, all across different racks potentially, across data centers, across regions. So your ability to have your systems stay online becomes greater because you have more options available to you to make it redundant. More options than, again, most of us may have already had. Some of you may already have highly available environments. Many of us have, single data center worlds where we don't have these options. So why consider services? Well, reliability may be something that you're considered. Managed. What do I mean by that? You're going to have the ability to define how much compute you want, but you will not have to manage that compute. You're just telling Microsoft, I want to put an application up in your world. I want to have this much resources sitting up underneath the hood, and they manage that. They manage the OS patching, the hardware replacement, the security patching, all of that. You manage your application. So you've eliminated that need to deal with infrastructure. The other one, it's very related to the word manage there, is your business focus. Very few of us on this call, I'm going to bet, are in the business of computer infrastructure. That's not your profit center. Your profit center is whatever your business does. With platform as a service, what it's allowing you to do for those applications that you move in that direction, it's allowing you to take your focus away from having to manage infrastructure to focusing on the application itself. its redundancy, its updates, its configurations and capabilities, and allows you to keep your focus in one area that actually could generate business for the business. I will say say this first: we're most likely not going to be jumping in this world as if to the deep end of the pool, and here we go, and all my infrastructure's gone. We're most likely going to be living in a world where infrastructure is still going to be a part of our world for the foreseeable future. Active Directory will be part of our world for the foreseeable future. What we're talking about today are ways to start making that move so that you change the way you do IT and maybe get away from some of the routine maintenance work and move more into the development work and the increasing of capabilities and features world. So that's some of the reasons why you want to move to services on that. Again, cost is just a piece of it. It's generally what you're getting and what you can do to generate more income. So now we're going to roll through a few features that we get asked regularly. And this first one here, what about my Active Directory? I've had some slides on this before in general migrations, but I'm going to cover them again because this is like the question we get all the time. And it's understandable because you've moved to the cloud, you have Office 365 potentially. If not, if you have Azure, either way, you have an Entra ID directory. And now the question immediately becomes, well, why can't I just use that for everything? And the answer is that's because not all applications answer or can respond and communicate with the Entra ID directory. They still need to talk to an Active Directory because an Active Directory provides you the LDAP and the Kerberos and the things that many applications over many, many years have been written to need as far as communications and authentication and things like that. So Active Directory is going to be a part of our world. But what we're going to talk about is the Entra ID Domain Services in this particular piece here. Is a way of having Active Directory to support those things that still need Active Directory, but have an opportunity to start disengaging from the on-premise Active Directory. That sentence will make a little more sense as we move along. So what can you do with your Active Directory? Well, the first thing you can do, and this isn't a platform as a service answer, this first one, is you can extend your AD into the cloud by putting Windows VMs up in Azure and making them a domain controller and just extending your AD to a new AD site and having AD in the cloud. No functional change in what you're doing. This is really an infrastructure as a service solution, but that's one of the things you can do. You can migrate everything to something that supports an Entra ID authentication. The most common question we get is, well, can I move everything into Office 365? Generally speaking, are there file shares? And the answer to that is yes, maybe. You have to have a fairly simplistic folder structure. You have to have a fairly simplistic security structure, and we could possibly do that. But most people still need a real file share because of the way the security is laid out, the folder structures, permissions, and all of that stuff. You still need that. But with Entra ID Domain Services, we may have a way to potentially use your Entra ID as the authentication point for a file share. And we'll see that as I work through some of the slides. But that's one of the things you can do. Getting off of AD and onto Entra ID is where the world is probably going in the future. So we can get down to one directory. We're just not there yet. So we're looking at ways of living in both worlds at the time, and domain services will be one way to deal with that, which is the third thing you can do. We can implement domain services, which is a separate managed AD domain for which we can establish a trust and move things up into the cloud into that AD so that they have the types of authentication they need. Still using Entra ID accounts through replication to gain access to that stuff. So there's things we can do. To see that graphically, this first image here is that first thing you can do, and is what is most commonly done right now because this is the quick way to start moving your infrastructure up into the cloud as we're dealing with servers. What you're going to do here is just put Windows VMs up in the cloud, make them a domain controller, and now your AD has 2 sites now in what's showing in this diagram here. Just another AD site for replication that's going on, and you can have your Windows VMs up in here, and everything functions as it does today. From there, we can synchronize this AD over into Entra ID. Most of you probably do that through the Entra Connect application. Now what we have is the same format of my login, Dave, is now replicated into Entra ID and still looks like Dave. So I log in as Dave, and I'm now gaining access to Office 365 applications using an Entra ID, but it's the same format as my AD. And now with the same login, at least how the user perceives it, I'm logging in to an on-prem stuff and to the cloud stuff. And potentially with configuration, it is the same ID because maybe I'm using single sign-on. So a lot of us are doing that now to gain access to Office 365. As more applications start becoming Entra ID compliant, you'll have your accounts up in the cloud to do that. But for applications that still need LDAP, still need Kerberos, things like that, there's a managed service called Domain Services that is an active directory that it starts with 2 domain controllers. It can grow beyond that are Microsoft managed. You don't have access to these domain controllers. You have access to the Active Directory, but not to the domain controllers themselves. They are a service that is attached to a virtual network that will support those types of logins for LDAP and Kerberos, things like that. The accounts in this domain come from your Entra ID. So now Entra ID has now become the authoritative directory for what's sitting over here in Domain Services, because this synchronization, which happens automatically, you don't configure that, brings the accounts over. I should caveat that. You can configure, and we'll see a little later, whether you want all the accounts synchronized or just cloud-only accounts and things like that. But other than that, it's just going to synchronize the accounts into here. And then if you need some kind of communication between your AD and this AD, we can build trusts between them at forest level trusts. So we can start to make our move and getting some of our LDAP-based and Kerberos-based things over here using Entra ID as the authoritative directory, which would have the same looking ID. This Dave that was in AD is the same Dave that's in Entra, is now a Dave over in this domain as well, and now can gain access to these types of resources. So we can start that process of supporting something in AD while not actually having to build an Active Directory infrastructure still. Okay, so that's where that fits. It's a managed domain, does LDAP, group policies, all this other stuff. It's done through, again, Entra ID is the authoritative directory to this here, and we can join systems to it. It's all communicated on a separate virtual network than anything else in your Azure, with a separate subnet underneath of that, and we'll see some of these images a little later in the presentation here. Accounts are synchronized, like I mentioned. You can manually create accounts in that domain. So if you have service accounts that you want to have created, you can just go into AD like you do today, same tools, and just create new independent accounts that are right there in that domain. So it can be for whatever you need. That particular service comes in 3 different SKUs: standard, enterprise, and premium, based on performance and backup times is probably the biggest 2 distinguishers of these things. And you can change SKUs as necessary. So you could start with standard, see how it looks, and as your performance requirements go up, you start stepping up the SKU on that. Now the SKU is defining how robust those domain controllers are, that hardware that they're going to be building up underneath the hood. So here we are, a screenshot of what it looks like to start creating Entra Domain Services, and I'm just going to capture a couple things so that I'm not going to walk you through the whole process. The first thing I want to point out is when you create this new domain, you're going to create a DNS domain name. This DNS domain is not your AD DNS, but it is something that you should be able to manage. It should be a routable domain that you own that will be the domain of that AD. And of course, you can define what region you want it in and what SKU you want to deploy on that. Networking, you're going to create a virtual network for it with you're going to create a virtual network for this domain and a default subnet. Now we can add off of that as we move on, but you're going to have to do that because Microsoft was going to take these two managed DCs that you don't have access to and attach them to this subnet you're defining here. For administration, we need to populate this group right here. So this is the users that will be granted. Now, these are going to be users that come out of Entra ID. These are going to be the users that will be granted access to manage the AD. So this is not a domain admin or enterprise admin, as we'll see in a minute. I think I have a slide on this. You don't have those groups in this domain. You have to be a member of this, add the members to it. Those are the user IDs that can manage the Active Directory. And here is the synchronization setting. You know, do I want to get everything I've put into Entra ID, which could have come from AD through synchronization, or do I only want to get my cloud-only accounts? So maybe there's a scenario where you have your AD users synchronized because they're gaining access to Office 365, but maybe you want an independent domain that has different sets of users. And so you're going to create cloud-only accounts for those and only bring those over into the domain to manage that, you know, to be in that domain and gain access to whatever application you're putting into that domain. So we're defining the networking, we're defining who's administrating it, how it's synchronizing, et cetera. So we got a lot of settings as we set this up. One of the things we are setting up, and I don't have a slide for it over here, is how we authenticate to systems in that domain. And we'll see that when we hit to the Azure Files world, okay? So when I talk about that later. So Microsoft manages this. They do the updates for you, the security patches and the monitoring. You can only have one forest/domain per tenant because it's synchronized from Entra ID. You can't have multiples of the domain. It's one domain for your tenant on that. You have the same AD administrative tools, but since you don't have access to the domain controllers, you are going to have to put a VM out there to put your tools on, joined to that domain so that you can manage the AD in that. When Microsoft creates this for you, they put two DCs into the domain as the domain controllers. These are what's called a replica set. Anytime we're going to deal something with DCs, they're always going to come in twos in replica sets. They are put in separate availability zones. Now, what that means is in a region, there are multiple data centers. Each data center is an availability zone. So your DCs are not even in the same data center. So you have data center failover, high availability at this point. You can have additional replica sets, up to 5. So if you wanted to add something in another region, you need the AD out in the West, for instance. You have your first one in the East, now you need this one out in the West. You can put another replica set out there into the West, and you need to then create a global VNet peer between these regions. If you put it in a third region, you need to have a global VNet peer between all the regions. They need to be in a full mesh configuration because all synchronization is intra-site replicated. I'll have a picture on that will maybe clarify that a little bit. All right. Domain services require password hashes for authentication. So if you're doing synchronization, you need to include the password hash in that synchronization. If you have in-cloud accounts, it just won't pick up the hash. After the domain services have been created, you have to change those passwords. Then there's a hash that becomes available in the other domain. But the hash is needed. And I mentioned it because sometimes in synchronization, we're not all synchronizing our password hashes because maybe we're doing some form of SSO or something like that where we don't need them. But if you're going to implement this, you got to enable that. Okay. All right, so here's what this looks like. You're going to build in those screens when we did the build. We told it we wanted a VNet and a subnet. So we defined that, and Microsoft attached their DCs to the subnet that we defined. Now this is a normal VNet, so we can go ahead and add another subnet if we want to put our workload out there. So we can put our servers in another subnet. You can put them in the same subnet. I'd recommend you have a separate subnet just to keep the DCs by themselves. If you have another VNet for where your application load is, you could do a VNet peer between these within the same region so that these devices can access these DCs that are in this separate domain. Okay, so VNet peering will gain access across VNets to gain access to these domain controllers in this domain. If you go cross-region, here's where you need to start probably more specifically considering building your full mesh. Once you cross regions, we need to build a global VNet peer. So in this diagram, region A needs to be able to see region B and C. C needs to see A and B. If I have a VNet peer within same regions, these all need to be meshed because this is going to be one big world of intra-site replication, so that if I have a device in the upper left VNet here, it may need to talk to a DC down in region C for some really weird reason. I don't know, but it needs to be able to get there. So you need to be building these full mesh worlds. All right, so that's just some of the parameters around building this. And we'll have to look at your infrastructure to see where this fits inside of or on top of what you're already doing in your Azure infrastructure design now. So some limitations. I've already mentioned you don't have a domain admin and enterprise role. You have to populate that AD administrators group to maintain access to this. It does not support certificate services. So there's no smart card authentication in here. No hybrid join devices. So you can't have a device joined to this and to Entra ID at the same time. So there'll be no Intune enrollment going on for these devices on the in this domain. And no schema extensions. So as you can tell, this is not like, hey, let's replace my Active Directory and just use this. This is like an interim step to handle an authentication need for an application. That's where this fits. It's a long-term solution, but it's really a migration type of solution until all applications can maybe use Entra ID natively. So that's one thing. Domain services, that's a platform as a service. Azure Files, one of the things we always get asked is, what about my files? Can I move them to SharePoint? And as I mentioned earlier, maybe, maybe not. Most times not. So Azure Files is a platform as a service that handles your file shares for you without having to have a server. And it's based off of the storage account. You're going to build an Azure, or going to create an Azure storage account and define Azure Files as the primary service of that, for which then you are going to create shares. Users can then just make a connection to your share. These can be SMB or NFS shares. When you're building this, you can build it on the standard tier, HDD drives, or premium tier, SSD drives. You can use a provisioned model where you pay for what you provision. Now, you're provisioning IOPS, throughput, storage, all of that. Whatever you provision, that's what you're paying for, but you're getting that guaranteed performance. Or you have the pay-as-you-go model. So you just pay for what you use along the way. So what's available is available for you. We can also, if you have an on-premises world now, and many people are moving back that way, or at least somewhat, there's an Azure File Sync service. So you could put a server on-prem to be the on-prem access for your data, and users can gain access to the local device. Now, what is on this server is a cache, not all of the data, it's a cache. So users get on-prem performance for anything cached, and if there needs to be a file retrieved, well, the caching service will bring it across, and now, so there'll be a little slowness there, but then it will have on-prem performances for you. So that will deal with an on-prem world. Doesn't necessarily help if you're, if you're in an Azure world already and you're trying to access Azure file shares, you don't need this. This is for an on-prem solution here, mostly. To log in, authenticate, to have an identity to this, it can be done through Active Directory. Now I'm going to move a little quick through this. You will have these slides so you can read them for yourselves. When you enable file shares, you're going to enable AD as the authentication method, and it will create an object. It will be the kind of the pointer, the place for which it would create the ticket for the Azure storage, Azure file shares. You create the shares with Entra ID. You use AD with a system mounted to that share to create the ACLs in that using AD. And then users will just connect to AD, get the ticket based off that object created, and be able to get out to the file shares and gain access. So I have my data in the cloud, but I'm still using AD. Or I can put it in my Entra Domain Services. Now, again, when you enable the Azure Files, you enable it for domain services authentication. You create your shares, you mount your files, and you with the key, and you set your ACLs based off of the Entra ID, which, remember, is the authoritative directory synchronizing into domain services, as you can see in this arrow right here. Users then access file shares using their Entra ID credentials, which are what's replicated over here, get their key from the domain, and get their access. Notice what we've done by this point is we've got our file shares in the cloud, and we're starting to move authentication over to the Entra ID. So we're getting our foot in that world, where we've gotten a little bit away from Active Directory here. And then there's the hybrid, where we can do Active Directory for setting the keys, but we're going to use Entra ID for the authentication. Keys. Yeah, the Kerberos tickets. I'm sorry. Tickets. Sorry. I've been using keys. Sorry about that. So I'm going to use Entra ID for authentication. I'm going to get my key out of AD. So I'm kind of in a mix of both worlds there at that point. But again, I've gotten some of my world out of the AD world. And my service, my file shares, the thing I care about, are not running on a server. They're running on a service. All right. And they're highly available. So remember, this is a storage account. A storage account can be deployed like for any other purposes with local replication, so that you have 3 copies in a data center, or replicated across regions, or zone replicated. So I have this high availability for my Azure files. So if Microsoft, let's say I'm zone replicated, if Microsoft loses a data center, I still have my Azure files going on, and people are still working as they need to. This is all created when you create the storage account. You're telling it you want it to be an Azure file system. You're picking its performance, the standard HDD or premium SSD, and what kind of redundancy do you want for that storage account. So it's using all the same things that a regular storage account for blob storage or whatever would be doing here. Nothing's really different, except that now that you've set it for file shares, you can go in and start creating shares right in the console and setting your share permissions. Remember, the ACLs are then set by mounting it and setting your ACLs from there. So to migrate to this, generally, I'm seeing a lot of people want to use Robocopy because it's quick, simple, and it's what we've always done. Since this understands Windows NTFS permissions, Robocopy can just copy the permissions over. But you can also use Storage Mover, File Sync, Storage Migration Program, etc., to move the data into Azure Files. So there's plenty of ways we can do this. And again, Robocopy is probably because it's most familiar, why it continues to still be the popular way of dealing with it. So it's just so much easier to do what you already know how to do. So as far as data protection, we've talked about replication. Snapshots, a typical feature of Azure Storage. Soft delete, a typical feature of Azure Storage. So if you delete something, I can get it back. And of course, backup. Azure backup can be a cloud to cloud and never have to come across your VLAN or anything. Or if you have a third-party tool, it's accessible to you to do the backup. So Azure Files, a way to get rid of a file server and just have the service of file shares up there. And authentication could either be AD or Entra ID on that one. Azure SQL. Now this one could be a little tricky. There's just because there's so many options on this. How redundant do I want this? How do I want this to perform? What kind of database am I putting out there? I'm going to now take a little bit of time and just throw out a lot of stuff. And just you become familiar with it. And we can drill down with you later on the details. But hopefully I've given you something to be an anchor for which you can attach knowledge as you move through. So when you're dealing with the SQL world, we can always just put a Windows VM up there, install SQL on it, as we do today, just like it's on-prem, very much like an infrastructure as a service. Or we can move up to the platform as a service, which comes in 2 flavors, the managed instance or the virtualized database, the Azure SQL Database. Now, the Azure SQL Database can be on a single you-controlled, defined resource, or you can put it into something called an elastic pool, which is a pooled set of resources to support your databases. We'll talk about that in a minute here, but you're looking at either a managed instance or a SQL database. That's your platform as a service, and we're going to kind of work through this in a little bit right now. Deployment models, single database. You define what hardware you want sitting up underneath of it. You don't have to manage that. You're going to say, I just want a performance level of X, and you're going to pick a machine type as if you were selecting a VM, but that's the performance level you're asking for. You can take a database and put it on an elastic pool. Elastic pool is not SQL. It's the hardware sitting under the SQL that's there to support a collection of databases. You have 4 databases, for example. Each one gets busy at different times. You don't want to have to define the hardware for each one just so it can support that busy time and then the rest of the time be underutilized. You can put it on a pooled set of resources, so whenever a particular database gets busy, it uses most of the resources. And then when another database gets busy, it can use most of the resources. That's the elastic pool. Or a managed instance, which is the most compatible with the latest on-prem SQL Server. It's really designed for that lift and shift. You define what kind of performance you want under it. Here's my instance, move your data to it. Okay, now when you're going to start creating these databases, I'm going to give you a little example to kind of help explain some of the features. Right here is an image of creating a virtual database. The first thing you do is you define the database name. You define a server name. This is not a Windows server. This is a logical pointer server. This is what I'm going to use to make my management connection. This is for both databases and elastic pools. And if I don't have one, I can create one. And then it asks you if you want to put it in an elastic pool or not. So if I'm going to leave it at no, if I say no, I define the compute resources power. How much power do I want supporting this instance of the database? And how do I want this database redundant? How do I want this redundant down in here? And then it builds the database. If I have a collection of databases and I want to have a shared pool of resources to support them all, I create an elastic pool. So you give it a name, like, everything has to have a name. And then here's that server again. So there's this a logical server that just points to it. So you create a new server for it. And now you're defining the compute for the pool, not for the database itself. Here's the compute that will be on the pool. And configure. Here's where you define what service tier, which we'll drill into later. What kind of hardware platform, how many of them do you want in your pool in the VNet, how much storage, et cetera. So you're defining how much power and how much redundancy, which is what the service tier will define, you want in this pool that will sit up underneath your databases. The service tier comes, bases off the vCore purchasing model. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the DTU purchasing model, we'll talk about that in a minute. Each one has its availability capabilities, and we'll drill it in. We'll spend a little bit of time on the vCore just to kind of give you an example of what that does. The hardware configuration and the performance of the pool. Then you go out to the create a database, the same screen as you saw earlier. So we, database name, the server pool, the server name. Now you answer yes to the elastic pool. And you don't get to define hardware anymore because you did that in the elastic pool. You just pick the elastic pool that you defined, and that database lives on that pool. And now you create a second database, put it on the pool. Create a third database, put it on the pool. And they all share the resources. The managed instance, again, is made for the lift and shift. You're going to define the processing power that you want up underneath of it. You give it a name. You define the processing power that you want up underneath of it. And it's just going to create you an instance for which you can put your data. When you're creating this instance, the compute power in here, you're going to define, again, what service tier it's sitting on and what kind of licensing you're going to put to it. And how much of that you want. How much power do I want up underneath of me? Not just in processing power per, let's say, VM, let's do it that for, but how many of them do you want there supporting your managed instance, and how redundant you want it. So you're defining, here's what I want underneath of me, and then just create me an instance. After you define what's underneath of these things, this is the same with the SQL database, managed instance, all of this. You don't manage those servers now. They're not there for you to manage. You're just asking Microsoft for this much processing power and this much high availability. And then you manage your managed instance. So just keep that in mind, even though you're defining it. So the service tier is your redundancies. It defines the storage architecture, space, I/O limits, business continuity, and all these other things. Each purchasing model has its own service tier configurations. The DTU has its, and we'll talk about what that is in the next slide. It has a basic, standard, and premium service tier, which means basic has some level of redundancy, premium has more. vCore, some level of redundancy, hyperscale is even more. So they each have their service tiers in each purchasing model. See how this is starting to get confusing as to where this stuff sits. All right, so that's why I'm just kind of introducing it out there to you. And if you want to implement this, we can be talking with you about what the right match would be for you. In summary, I mean, not in summary, in a simple form, DTU is a simple pre-configured set. You're going to either want a low or high, and Microsoft will predefine in there how much I/O, how much storage, how much everything processing power you need. It's a mix. You're getting a bundle, if you will. Bundle's a good word. vCore lets you independently scale the various components, my storage, my compute, my volumes, my throughput, my IOs, all this other stuff. So I get to independently configure over here. I get a quick, simple package of a bundled set of resources. So let's talk about that service tier a little bit, and we're going to walk through the vCore aspect just so you have an idea of what we're talking about. In a general purpose service tier, it's basically a separation of your your SQL EXEs, SQL Server EXEs, and the storage. All right, and in this diagram, I'm just change the diagram a little bit. You have a server running SQL services that only has the temp DB on that box. The data and the logs are on Azure Storage outside of the box. It's configured with the primary and failover nodes. So you'll have high availability, but there'll be a failover that has to happen, and then you'll have access. There could be a hiccup. As you move up to the business critical, Microsoft's going to now give you an always-on availability group configuration, where each node has the data and the logs with it on its SSD, and all of them are in sync and replicated. Now, this requires more storage, will cost you more, and all that other stuff, but they're all active and ready to kick in and be available if one goes down, or service. That maybe this is a better way to look at it. I already have all the data and the logs on each box. I don't have to go out to Azure Storage. And if there's a failover, I'm going to one that's already active in the ring and knows everything. The hyperscale is getting to the point where now we're going to Microsoft is going to separate the different aspects of SQL so that you can tune each one of them, or better yet, they can tune each one of them. There's the the server EXE aspect of it, which has a non-covering cache just with the active data in it right there. And all it needs to know to talk to is the log service, which Microsoft can tune for data integrity and throughput, because all the log service need to know to do is how to talk to the EXE and how to talk to the caching service, which is the page servers. The page servers are pairs of servers that cache 128 gig each, and they cache all the data. So as needed, extra pairs come out so that all your data gets covered, and the log service is only talking to cached data, and then it only has to talk up to the EXE, and they can tune each one of these. And then there's the data segment. So this segmentation, so they can deal with performance in each of the aspects of it, is the hyperscale service tier, which is good for small companies and large, because the idea is to give you really tight controls on your performance. Right? The DTU just gives you a chart. Here's what you get with basic. Here's what you get with standard. Here's what you get with premium, because it's a bundle. So you're not going to tune any of those things. You're just going to take the performance that they need. So that's the DTU. All right, so now, of course, there's the managed instance, and I'm going to move through this one a little quick. The idea of the managed instance is it's the most compatible with the on-prem and is generally built for the quick lift and shift to get your database off an on-prem server and up into the cloud. All right, you still get some ability to configure what resources you want sitting up underneath of it, but that's all its purpose is for. So you have these, you have the single database, SQL Server. You can put the Azure databases on an elastic pool. That's another deployment type. Or you can put things out as a managed instance. Microsoft is saying that the managed instance is their most popular of the deployment right now. So a quick idea of what it looks like to migrate, very high level of how to move to a migration to a managed instance. You would use the SQL Migration Wizard in the Azure Studio. What that tool will do is synchronize the SQL backups between your on-prem server and the managed instance. When you're ready to cut over, you will just stop transactions, do a tail log of on-prem that will sync it up to the managed instance, and then you can update the connections to the databases. That's probably the biggest step you have there. Okay. All right. So the migration can happen not seamless, but quick. Again, the updating connections could be the thing that takes you the longest. So you are going to have a downtime aspect to that. So there's an example of what a migration might look like. The web app service. I'm going to move quickly through here because this is a lot like the SQL. The idea is through what they now call the app service plan, you define the horsepower that's sitting up underneath of your web app. How many servers, what kind of horsepower, etc. Microsoft now manages those. You don't. You manage the app. It's going to sit on top of that. So the app service plan is really how it's priced. It's much like the SQL Elastipool type of concept. You're building a platform underneath of it saying, Microsoft, I want this much resource to support my web app. Right. When you go to do the deployment of this, of an app service, you tell it what kinds of apps you're going to be publishing up there. Like I say, like this example showing you this is going to be a .NET app. It's going to be running on Windows. So that's the kind of hardware you're going to be wanting up underneath of you. You're going to give it a name and what kind of pricing plan. The pricing plan is what kind of hardware do I want sitting up underneath of that. And depending on, and you have all these choices here, everything from basic to premium to standard, all these other things. Shared is shared. It's shared resources with other people. Others are yours, built as a pool sitting underneath it. So you have all these hardware levels, as you can see, an awful lot to be deciding on, hard to cover in a webinar. But just so you understand that you do have a lot of different performance options available to you. And depending on what you pick, this is showing standard. So that's why this is grayed out. If I had premium, for instance, I could say, I want my hardware zone redundant underneath of it. So my web applications have processing power and redundancy sitting underneath the app. And then as we go into the deployment, how do my deployment tools interact with this web app? Do I want to have it enabled for continuous deployment out of my development tools? Do I want to have a GitHub access to it, etc.? So I'm configuring how my web app, now I'm looking at the top half here, how that communicates with my development so I can start deploying code and getting my pages updated as need be. So I've defined the pricing plan, the hardware, and now how I get my code and stuff into the apps itself. If I have a web app that needs to access an on-prem SQL server, they have that option as well. So you don't have to do a lift and shift of everything, SQL and web app. I can move my web app and still let it talk to the on-prem server through something called the relay hybrid connection. When you're configuring that, you define what the SQL server name is, because the web app is going to make a call to the SQL server. We'll put it in this queue, call it a queue, that the hybrid configuration manager, a piece of software we'll put on-prem, accesses. And this little agent needs just to be able to resolve the name. So you're telling the web host, when you're ready to get your SQL, just call that SQL name, and the agent will know where to find it and put the data back for you. So you define the name of the queue, and then you tell the agent how to connect to that queue, because when you get a connection string that tells the agent how to get to the queue. So the web app drops it in the queue, the agent picks it up from the queue, and your web app talks to your SQL data and back again. So now we can move one thing first and the other thing second, and we'd be okay with that. Serverless. Now, this is just a quick rundown of some other features that Microsoft had. Like I mentioned in the beginning, this is an overview. And these are just some of the things that we have been asked about. We've been asked about Active Directory, file shares, SQL, web servers. These are just common. This is why they're showing up in this webinar. But we're starting to get some questions about some of these other little services that are out there. Maybe not so little, but they don't require a service. You don't require you to be building a lot of hardware up underneath of it. There's some of them will ask you for that. They're just there for you to use. You pay for them as you need them. There's no real provisioning of managing of servers. They're just dynamically scalable, you know, and they're ready. They're just there for use and for quick deployment. One of them would be like Azure Functions. Allows developers to execute event-driven functions so that if trigger A happens, I want I want this action to take place. You know, so here's an event triggered, and I'm going to run a function to do something. I'm going to go to Azure, create a resource, select Azure function, and I'll have a couple slides on this in a minute here, but it will, just allows you without a server to have some communication between your various aspects. So app A can talk to app B, etc. So Azure Functions. Logic apps, similar in concept. It builds these workflows and orchestrated tasks so that something happens, I make a notification, I put data here, I start accessing that, and you build this logic of things that you want to happen. A business process is that you're going to build, and you're not going to deploy servers for this. You're going to go to Azure, create a resource, select logic apps, and start creating this thing. What am I going to monitor? What am I going to connect to? What am I going to send to, etc. So you can be building automation into your world without having to deploy something to build automation into your world. You're using the service that's already there for you. Event
And Dave,
grid.
you have probably a couple minutes or so left to finish up the slides. I know you have almost there, but just wanted to give you a little time check.
Got it. Thanks. Event grid is just a place to centralize events and routing, so that if you have, if you want, again, this is this communication between applications and services and functions, and there's need to be a place for routing events so that one can pick up something from another. So there's event grid for you. And the Cosmo database is a serverless, globally distributed multi-mode database service. So if you're not using SQL, you can use Cosmos and not have to deal with deploying infrastructure to do that. So these are just some of the things that are out there, and there's more. I picked 4 just to say, hey, there's these connection and automation things. The automation is the word you want to grab onto that one. All right, real quick, creating a function app right off the Azure portal, create an app. I want to create a resource. I want it to be a function app. You talk about what kind of capabilities and features you want available to it by picking one of these services, and because of time, I'm just going to say that's what you do, and I'm going to move on. You define what kind of code will run in your stack so it knows how to process what this is going to be doing. And here's where you would see your list of functions, and also where you would create a new function. And if the function has keys or files or part of a deployment string, or has variables or authentication methods, you can define all of that. All I'm basically saying here is the function is more than just a little batch file. It can be fairly robust, but that automation, again, that's the word you want to grab onto with this. So we've talked about domain services for anything that you want to try to wean away from Active Directory. File shares, SQL services, very confusing topic, probably needs to be reviewed again and again to understand, well, what purchasing model, what service tier, how does this database interact, all of that. But we did talk about that. App services, very similar to SQL, underlying hardware. You manage the app sitting on top of that. And there's various functions and serverless features available to you to pick to just start this automation and this connectivity up in your environment that are there just to use without having to deploy infrastructure. So that was a little rapid fire. And we probably have no time for questions. I'm sure if there's any, Chris can go ahead and email them to me, and we can reply back.
Absolutely. I'll provide
Chris,
the
I'll
questions there.
hand it
We
back to you.
appreciate we appreciate the questions we have. I think there are 3, and we'll make sure we reply to you in writing on that. Obviously, a big topic today. Hopefully, we've kind of given you a good overview. If you want to know some more, you can just note that in your evaluation. We'd be happy to sit down and start exploring what might make sense for you. And as Dave noted, we only did a piece of this world, even though it takes a lot to talk about, even the piece. So thank you very much today for the information. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you soon and communicating more with you about Azure Services. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.